The shot was a splinter of sound cracking the baked-air silence of Silver Creek. Then another. Glass shattered, a high crystalline scream that was answered by the deeper guttural panic of men and the shrieks of women. From his perch on the rocky outcrop overlooking the town, where the world was a silent tapestry of red rock and bleached sky, noon arose. He was a man who moved with the economy of a hunting cat, every muscle and sinew aligned with a purpose that was as old as the land itself. The smoke, a dirty gray plume, rising from the heart of the town, was wrong. It was not the soft, wood-scented smoke of a hearth, but the acrid signature of gunpowder. He descended the game trail, his moccasins making no sound on the gravelly earth. He was not a part of the town, nor did he wish to be. He was a ghost here, a remnant of a people the world had decided to forget, trading his silence for their indifference. But the chaos below was a magnet, a tear in the fabric of the day, that pulled him inexorably forward. By the time he reached the edge of the main street, the robbery was over. Dust, thick and choking, mingled with the lingering gun smoke, painting the scene in a hazy, dreamlike wash. Men with rifles stood in stunned clusters, their bravery arriving a moment too late. The doors of the Silver Creek Bank hung splintered on their hinges, a gaping wound in the town's facade. But it was the tableau in the center of the street that held him. A woman lay in the dust, her dress a dark, spreading stain of crimson against the pale earth. Beside her, a child knelt, a girl no older than 10, her thin shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. Nona moved closer, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows of the general store's awning. He saw the girl's face smudged with dirt and tears, her blue eyes wide with a horror that was too vast for her small frame. Her hands were clutched tightly around a single object, pressing it to her chest as if it were the last solid thing in a collapsing world. It was a silver locket, tarnished and dented, hanging from a delicate chain. As the girl's fingers trembled, it swung free, catching a shard of the brutal Arizona sun. The light flashed upon an engraving, an image etched with loving care, a hawk, its wings outstretched in a silent, powerful soar. The world tilted. The sounds of the town, the shouts, the weeping, the distant frantic clang of a bell faded to a dull, hollow roar in his ears. The image of the hawk ripped through the carefully constructed walls of his solitude, a key turning in a lock he thought long rusted shut. A memory fragmented and sharp as broken glass tore through him, a woman's laughter, the scent of wood smoke and wild sage in her hair. The feel of a similar silver hawk, warm from her skin, pressed into his palm. Nantan, my chief, my protector. The ghost of her voice, a whisper from a life that was now dust. The girl Abigail looked up, then her gaze finding his. He expected fear. He was, after all, the town's specter, the Apache who lived at the foot of the hills, a creature of rumor and suspicion. But he saw no fear in her eyes, only a raw, bottomless void of loss. Her gaze dropped to the 2 swaddled bundles lying in a crate beside her mother's body, miraculously undisturbed by the violence. They were infants, their faces serene in sleep. He saw it all in a single heart-stopping instant, and the dead mother, the orphaned girl, the helpless babes, and the locket. The hawk that was a mirror to the ghost hawk that haunted his own soul. He was a man who had renounced all earthly ties, who had methodically carved feeling from his heart until it was as hard and barren as the desert stone. He had walked alone by choice, believing solitude was the only shield against a pain that could unmake a man. But the girl's grief, the locket's silent call, the impossible weight of the moment, they were a tide that swept away his defenses. The past was not dead. It was here, breathing in the dust, looking at him through a child's shattered eyes. He felt a connection forged between them, not of pity, but of a shared sacred wound. He who had lost everything was staring at the fresh wreckage of a life just like his own. He knew this desolation. He knew the silence that would follow. He knelt, his movements slow and deliberate so as not to startle her. He did not speak. Words were useless things against such a monumental sorrow. He simply reached out a hand, not to the girl, but to the locket she clutched. His calloused finger gently traced the outline of the soaring hawk. Abigail watched him, her sobbing quieted by a flicker of confusion. In that moment, a bond was sealed, silent and absolute. He was no longer a ghost seeking oblivion on the horizon. The horizon had come to him, bringing with it a purpose he had long since buried. He would not let the silence claim these children. He would stand between them and the wilderness, the one of rock and sand, and the one that lived in the hearts of men. He looked from the locket to the girl and then to the sleeping infants. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, a promise made not in words, but in the stark, shared language of loss. He was a guardian once more. The cabin was a sanctuary, built of silence and memory, nestled where the jagged teeth of the hills met the flat, sun-scorched plain. For years, its profound quiet had been Nuna's only companion. Now that silence was shattered, replaced by a symphony of unfamiliar sounds, the piercing, demanding cry of a hungry infant, the softer mewling of another, and the quiet, resilient whisper of a girl's voice. "This is Jonah," Abigail said, her tone as serious as a physician's. She pointed to the smaller of the twins, whose face was screwed up in a red, wrinkled knot of displeasure. "He gets angry when he's hungry. Levi, he just sleeps." She became his teacher in this strange new world. Abigail, with a solemn dignity that belied her 10 years, showed him everything. He, a man who could track a deer for 3 days over stone and sand, was a clumsy novice in the nursery. His large, scarred hands, accustomed to the heft of a rifle and the curve of a skinning knife, fumbled with the makeshift diapers made from a torn flour sack. Tighter, she would instruct her small hands guiding his, or it will fall. She showed him how to test the warmth of the precious goat's milk on his wrist, how to coax a stubborn bubble of air from a tiny stomach, and how to soothe a rising fever with cool cloths steeped in willow bark tea. Those first days blurred into a cycle of exhaustion and discovery. Nuna, who had forgotten how to care for anything, even himself, felt an unfamiliar purpose begin to bloom in the barren landscape of his chest. He watched Abigail as she hummed a lullaby to her brothers, a tune of heartbreaking sweetness, a melody her mother must have sung. In her, he saw a reflection of a strength he once knew, a fierce maternal resolve that life had forced upon her far too soon. He had invited the world back in, and as he rocked Jonah in the pre-dawn quiet, feeling the fragile life settle against his chest, he felt the first terrifying crack appear in the armor he had so carefully constructed around his heart. The past was no longer a distant echo. It was a living, breathing thing in his home. But news in the West, especially news that defied the natural order of things, travels on the wind, spreading like a prairie fire through the dry hearts of men. The story of 3 white children living under the roof of an Apache was a spark in the tinderbox of Silver Creek. The town's prejudice was a quiet, simmering thing, a constant presence like the heat that radiated from the ground. It required only the right fuel to erupt into open flame. That fuel came in the form of Sheriff Elias Thorne. Thorne was a man carved from the rigid timber of certainty. His world was divided cleanly into black and white, civilized and savage, saved and damned. To him, the situation at the foot of the hills was not a story of compassion, but a violation, a stain upon the moral fabric of his town. His footsteps were heavy and purposeful. As he made his way through Silver Creek, his voice a low, authoritative rumble in the saloon and the general store. He gathered the fear and suspicion of the citizenry, like a flock, his words painting Nuna not as a rescuer, but as a wolf. Whispers turned to declarations. Concern fanned by the sheriff's righteous certainty curdled into outrage. The Apache was not a savior, they murmured. He was a danger. The children were not safe. They were captives. The first sign of the coming storm was not a shout, but a shadow that fell across the cabin's open doorway. Nuna looked up from the piece of wood he was carving a small, smooth hawk for Abigail, and saw a figure on horseback. It was Silas, a grizzled prospector, who, like Nuna, lived on the fringes of society and understood the value of staying unseen. Silas dismounted, his face grim. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Town's buzzing," he said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Sheriff's forming a posse. Says he's coming to liberate the Finch orphans." Nuna's hand stilled on the carving knife. He remained silent, his dark eyes fixed on the prospector, waiting. Silas shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the cabin where the sound of a waking baby could be heard. "It ain't just Thorn," he admitted, his voice dropping. "Jedediah Kane is riding at his right hand, fanning the flames, telling everyone you're a squatter on land he's got his eye on. Says the stream running through this patch is rightfully his." The pieces clicked into place. Jedediah Kane, a rancher whose vast holdings bordered Nuna's small, self-sufficient plot. A man whose ambition was as wide and rapacious as the territory itself. Suddenly, the sheriff's righteous crusade was cast in a different, uglier light. This wasn't just about blind prejudice. It was about calculated greed, using fear as a weapon to seize land and water the lifeblood of this arid country. The threat now had a face and a name. After Silas left, a profound stillness descended upon the cabin, heavier and more suffocating than any silence that had come before. Nuna's first instinct, honed by a decade of survival, was to flee. He could pack what little they had, and by sunrise, they would be ghosts in the mountains, swallowed by the canyons, where no sheriff would dare to follow. It would be a hard life, but a safe one. He looked at Abigail, who had heard everything from the doorway. Her small face was pale, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. He saw the terror in her eyes, but beneath it, something else, the same unbending resolve he had seen that first day. She had not run from her fate. She had faced it and tried to bargain with it. How could he do any less? He then looked down at the cradle he had built, at the two infants sleeping, their chests rising and falling in the innocent trust of the protected. To run would be to teach them that the world was a place to be feared and hidden from. To stay to fight was to teach them that a home once found was worth defending. The choice was a chasm before him. On one side lay the solitude and safety of the wilderness he knew. On the other, the fire and steel of a town that despised him, and the uncertain fate of the small family he had just begun to build. The man who had spent a lifetime erasing his own tracks now stood at a crossroads where the only path forward required him to stand up and be seen. He picked up the finished wooden hawk and handed it to Abigail. Her small fingers closed around it, a silent acceptance. In that moment, the battle within him was over. He walked to the corner of the cabin, his movements deliberate, and picked up his rifle. He checked the mechanism not with the familiar ease of a hunter, but with the grim purpose of a protector. He took a steadying breath, the scent of pine and dust filling his lungs. And for the first time in a decade, he did not turn his back on the world of men. He walked toward it. Walking into Silver Creek was like stepping into a different kind of wilderness. The threats here were not the rattlesnake coiled in the shade or the scorpion hiding beneath a stone. They were in the eyes of the men who stopped their conversations to watch him pass, in the way women pulled their children closer as if from a plague. Every footstep on the dusty main street was an intrusion. He carried nothing but the weight of the town's hatred, a burden far heavier than any pack. He kept his gaze fixed on the small weathered sign ahead, DR, Alistair Reed, physician. It was an outpost of logic in a territory ruled by fear, and it was his only hope. The doctor's office was an island of quiet order. The air smelled of carbolic soap and dried herbs. Rows of glass bottles lined the shelves, their contents labeled with a precise, scholarly hand. Dr. Reed was older, with spectacles perched on his nose, and a weariness in his eyes that spoke of long nights and too much human suffering. He looked up from his papers, his expression a careful mask of professional neutrality. Noona stood before the desk, his silence a stark contrast to the nervous energy of the town outside. He did not speak of injustice or make appeals to mercy. His words were few and deliberate, stripped down to the bone of truth. There is a girl. 2 infants. Orphans, he began, his voice low and even. They are in my care. They are fed, sheltered. Sheriff Thorne intends to take them, to send them away. He paused, letting the unadorned facts settle in the quiet room. They will be separated. He was not asking the doctor to pass judgment or to choose a side. He was asking him to be a witness. Dr. Reed listened without interruption, his fingers steepled before him. He had seen the worst of this land, not just the diseases that ravaged the body, but the hatreds that sickened the soul. He looked at the Apache standing before him, a man who carried himself with a profound, unshakable dignity, and saw not the monster the town described. As he considered the request, his gaze fell upon Noona's sleeve. There was a fine dusting of yellow pollen there, the kind that came from the petals of the chamomile flower, an herb known for its ability to soothe a feverish child. It was a small detail, one that would mean nothing to anyone else. But for Alistair Reed, it was evidence. It spoke of a tenderness that contradicted every rumor. The doctor had a past. He rarely spoke of a time in the East where he had witnessed men of supposed principle commit monstrous acts using the law as a shield for their cruelty. He had seen families destroyed in the name of order, and the memory had left an indelible scar on his conscience. In Noona, he saw an echo of that past, a chance to stand for the truth in a way he had failed to do before. A medical report, the doctor said finally, his voice calm, is a testament to fact in a world drowning in opinion. I will come to your cabin at dawn tomorrow. I will examine the children, and I will record my findings. A sliver of relief pierced through the tension, but the doctor wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his gaze intense. But you must understand, a piece of paper is not enough for men like Sheriff Thorne or Jedediah Kane. They are not interested in facts. They are interested in control. To fight a fire like that, you need more than water. You need a voice they cannot ignore. He paused. I will give you my report, and I will stand by it. But it comes with a condition. A report can be dismissed, but the truth spoken by the one who has lived it. That is a different kind of power. If I am to do this for you, you must bring the girl Abigail to the hearing. You will stand beside her, and you will let her tell her story. Her testimony will be our true defense. The condition hung in the air, a demand that was both a strategy and a profound test of faith. To save his new family, he had to risk exposing its most vulnerable member to the very wolves he was trying to protect her from. The first light of dawn spilled softly through the single window of the cabin. Dr. Reed arrived punctual as the sunrise and found not the chaotic, squalid den the town's rumors had conjured, but a home. It was humble, yet filled with a palpable sense of care. Noona greeted him with a nod. Abigail stood near the cradle, a small, fierce guardian, her eyes tracking the doctor's every move. He began his examination with Levi, his hands gentle but efficient, making meticulous notes in a small ledger. He found a baby who was underweight, yes, but who was also alert, clean, and clearly nourished. Then he turned to Jonah. The smaller twin had a persistent, wheezing cough that rattled his tiny frame. Dr. Reed's brow furrowed. An inflammation of the lungs, he diagnosed quietly. Dangerous in one so small. He reached into his bag for a dark bottle of laudanum-laced syrup, a harsh remedy that often did as much harm as good. It was then that Nuna moved. He held up a hand, a quiet request to pause. He left the cabin and returned moments later with a handful of silvery leaves and a piece of bark gathered from a resilient shrub that grew only in the high, rocky crags. He crushed them in a small stone bowl, the practiced motion of his hands, releasing a sharp, clean scent of pine and mint. He added hot water, letting the mixture steep. The knowledge of which plants healed and which harmed was a legacy, passed down through generations, a science that had no need for glass bottles or Latin names. He soaked a clean strip of cloth in the warm infusion, wrung it out, and gently laid the steaming poultice on Jonah's chest. He then lifted the infant and began to hum a low, monotonous chant, a sound that was less a song and more a vibration of healing and peace. Slowly, gradually, the harsh, ragged sound of Jonah's breathing began to soften. The frantic struggle in his small chest eased. The child's tense body relaxed against Nuna's shoulder. Dr. Reed watched, utterly captivated. He was witnessing a different kind of medicine, ancient, intuitive, and undeniably effective. He, a man of charts and chemicals, was seeing healing in its most elemental form. The respect in his eyes, which had been tentative and clinical now, became genuine and profound. He put his own bottle of syrup back into his bag unused. As he finished his notes, the quiet was shattered by the percussive sound of approaching horses. Too many and too fast. The door was thrust open, banging against the wooden wall. Sheriff Thorne stood silhouetted against the harsh morning light, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, flanked by 2 deputies. His cold eyes swept over the scene, the doctor, the Apache, holding the child, the girl standing defiantly before the cradle. "The time for talk is over," Thorne declared, his voice cutting through the peaceful air like a shard of glass. "Step aside, Apache. I'm here for the children." The air in the cabin grew thin and cold. Dr. Reed held up his ledger like a shield. "Sheriff," he began, his voice strained but steady, "these children are weak. To move them now would be irresponsible. My report states clearly." "Your report?" Thorne scoffed, taking a step into the room. His gaze was a physical force. "I don't need your ink-stained papers to tell me what's right. I see a savage with 3 white children. That's all the report I need." He fixed his eyes on Nuna. "Give me the boy." Nuna did not move. He held the sleeping Jonah closer. He could not win a fight of strength. But years of living in the wild had taught him how to read the subtlest signs, the flicker of doubt in a man's eyes. He saw it in the younger of the 2 deputies, a man named Miller, whose wife had recently given birth. It was to this man, not the sheriff, that Nuna finally spoke, his voice low and calm. "The boy's fever has just broken," he said, his gaze locked on Deputy Miller. "The steam from the herbs helps him to breathe. The morning air is cold." He let the unspoken threat hang in the air, allowing the man's own fears as a new father to complete it. Dr. Reed seized the opening. "Deputy Miller," he said, his tone sharp and authoritative, "you are a witness. You have seen me, a licensed physician, treating this child. If you assist in removing this infant against my direct medical advice, and any harm should come to him, I will testify to that fact in a court of law. You will be as responsible as the sheriff." The threat was no longer abstract. It was personal and legal. The deputy's face went pale. He took a half step back, a small but seismic shift in the balance of power. The sheriff saw the retreat, his face flushing with fury. He could not force the issue without the unwavering support of his men. For a long, tense moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. Thorne pulled his anger in reshaping it. He pointed a finger not at Nuna, but at the doctor. "You've won this little trick, Doc," he snarled. "But this is not over." He backed out of the doorway, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "This won't be settled in the shadows. I'm taking this matter before Judge Harlan Pike. We'll have a formal hearing, and the whole town will be there to see what justice really means." The immediate danger had passed, but in its place loomed a far larger and more formidable threat. A public spectacle where their fate would be decided by the very prejudice they had just narrowly escaped. In the days that followed, a fragile peace settled over the cabin. The threat of the hearing loomed a storm cloud on the horizon, but for now, they existed in its calm eye. A new routine took root. Nuna taught Abigail the secrets of his world, how to read tracks in the dust, which roots were sweet and which were poison. In return, she brought order to his solitary life, mending his worn clothes with small, precise stitches. Their two lives began to weave together. Dr. Reed became a regular visitor, his saddlebags filled not only with medical supplies, but with parcels of flour, and one afternoon, a thin, worn book of children's primers. "A mind needs nourishment as much as a body," he said. And so a new ritual began. By the fire in the evenings, Abigail would sit beside the doctor, her small finger tracing the shapes of letters as she sounded out her first words. Nuna would sit apart carving, but he listened to every sound, every small triumph, seeing the shape of a future for her he had never dared to imagine. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Abigail found it. Tucked away on a high ledge was the small wooden hawk he had carved years ago, its wings outstretched. "What is this?" she asked softly. Naona took the carving, his fingers closing around it with a familiarity that was both tender and painful. The silence that followed was heavy with ghosts. "It was for my son," he said, his voice rough, his eyes fixed on the fire. He was swift like the hawk. He saw everything. He did not offer more, but Abigail understood. Later that night, after Abigail was asleep, Dr. Reed spoke quietly. "The sickness that took your people, was it the one that makes the lungs fill with water?" Nuna nodded, his face a stoic mask. The doctor's expression was grim. "The burning sickness. Influenza. It's what orphaned the Finch children." The revelation settled between them. It was not random chance that had brought them together. They were all survivors of the same invisible war. Nuna was not just rescuing 3 orphans. He was rebuilding a family from the ashes of the one he had lost. This fragile sense of peace was shattered by a sharp official knock at the door. It was Deputy Miller alone this time. He stood on the threshold, holding his hat in his hands, his gaze fixed on the floor. He held out a folded piece of paper. "From Judge Pike," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The hearing. Friday next." He wouldn't meet Nuna's eyes. He simply turned and walked away, a man doing a job he no longer believed in. Nuna took the paper. The printed words, the official seal, were symbols of a world that sought to impose its rigid, unfeeling logic on the fragile beating heart of the family he had just begun to build. The calm was over. The storm had arrived. The day of the hearing arrived under a bleached, indifferent sky. The journey into Silver Creek was a silent procession through a gauntlet of hostile eyes. Nuna walked with a straight back, a silent mountain of resolve. Beside him, Abigail matched his stride, her hand tucked tightly into his. Dr. Reed walked on her other side, a grim-faced guardian. They were a clan of 3 against an entire town. The courtroom was packed a humming hive of suspicion and morbid curiosity. At the front, behind a massive oak bench, sat Judge Harlan Pike. His face was a landscape of deep lines, his eyes hooded and unreadable. Sheriff Thorne was the first to speak. He stood before the judge not as a lawman, but as a preacher, his voice booming with righteous conviction. He painted a vivid picture of imperiled innocence and savage influence, twisting Nuna's quiet solitude into sinister secrecy. Then, to solidify his case, he called his only witness. "I call Mr. Jedediah Kane to the stand." Kane strode forward, dressed in his finest clothes, his face a mask of concerned citizenship. But beneath the performance, his eyes held the cold glint of avarice. Kane's testimony was a masterclass in calculated malice. He described Nuna not as a man, but as a trespasser, a squatter with no legal claim to the land or the water. He twisted Nuna's quiet life into a threat, inventing tales of strange chants heard on the wind at night. As he spoke, he would occasionally touch a worn leather wallet in his breast pocket, a subtle nervous gesture that only Nuna seemed to notice. The true nature of the threat was laid bare. This was a conspiracy of greed and bigotry. The sheriff would get his moral victory, and Kane, his most influential supporter, would get the land. When Kane finished, a triumphant smirk on his face, a heavy silence fell. The case against Nuna seemed absolute. Judge Pike looked down from his bench. "You have heard the testimony presented against you." The judge's voice was a low, gravelly rumble. "What do you have to say?" Nuna rose slowly. He did not look at the judge or the hostile crowd. He looked down at Abigail. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, a silent transfer of strength. Then he lifted his head and spoke, his voice clear and steady. "I have nothing to say for myself. My words are wind. There is only one voice in this room that speaks the truth of this matter." He paused. "I ask the court to hear the testimony of Abigail Finch." A collective gasp went through the room. Sheriff Thorne shot to his feet, his face red with outrage. "Your Honor, this is a mockery. You can't let a child." Judge Pike silenced him with a single sharp rap of his gavel. "The witness has been called sheriff. She will be heard." All eyes turned to Abigail as she made her way to the imposing witness chair. She clutched the small carved hawk in her lap, her knuckles white. She looked at Nuna, and he gave her a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was all she needed. She took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her voice was a clear, steady note that cut through the oppressive atmosphere. She did not begin with accusations. She began with a story. She spoke of the silence after the coughing sickness, the terrible, hollow quiet in her small house. She spoke of the hunger that gnawed at her, and the worse hunger she saw in the faces of her infant brothers. She described walking into Silver Creek, a town full of people who looked through her as if she were a ghost. And then, her voice trembling for the first time, she spoke of the moment she had stood before the tall, silent Apache, the moment she had made an impossible offer. "I thought," she said, her eyes welling with tears she refused to let fall, "that if I could save one, it would be enough. That was the best I could do." The courtroom was utterly still. The hard-faced ranchers and their wives, the cynical prospectors, they were no longer watching a spectacle. They were listening to the confession of a child's heartbreak. Then her voice grew stronger. "But he didn't choose," she said, looking directly at the judge. "He took all of us." She described her life in the cabin, not in grand terms, but in a tapestry of small, irrefutable truths. She spoke of how Nuna had taught her the names of the constellations, of the low humming lullaby he sang to the twins of the poultice he made for Jonah's chest. "Dr. Reed has books and medicines," she stated simply, "and Nuna has the earth and the wind. Both of them make us safe." She held up the carved hawk. "He made this for me, so I would have something that was mine. He has never once raised his voice. He has never been anything but kind. She had dismantled the sheriff's monster brick by brick, lie by lie, and replaced it with a portrait of a father. The atmosphere in the room had transformed. The hostility had dissolved into a profound, uncomfortable shame. When Abigail finished, a deep silence held the room. It was no longer the silence of judgment, but of reflection. Judge Pike sat motionless for a long time. His hooded eyes scanned the faces of his town. Finally, his gavel came down again, not with a crack, but with a soft, final thud. The petition brought by Sheriff Thorne is denied, he declared. A wave of relief, silent and profound, washed over Nuna. But the judge was not finished. Furthermore, this court grants temporary guardianship of Abigail Finch, Jonah Finch, and Levi Finch to the man known as Nuna. It was a victory, but the judge raised a hand for silence. This decision, however, is not without conditions. This court orders that the children are to receive a formal education to be overseen by Dr. Reed. He will submit a report to this court every 6 months. He then looked directly at the crowd, his voice hardening. And a final condition, one that falls upon all of you. This family is now under the protection of the law. Any act of prejudice, any whisper of malice directed at them, will be considered a direct contempt of this court. They have earned their peace. It is now the duty of this town to see that they have it. The verdict should have been the end. But as Nuna, Abigail, and Dr. Reed left the courthouse, Jedediah Kane stood waiting on the steps, his face a thunderous mask of fury. The mask of concerned citizen was gone, replaced by something raw and venomous. "This isn't over," Savage Kane hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "The law in this town is a joke. But there's a higher law out here. The law of retribution." His eyes burning with an almost insane fire locked onto Nuna. "I know who you are. I've been looking for you for 5 years. The hawk locket your woman wore. I'll see it again before I send you to hell." Nuna froze. The hawk locket. Kane couldn't have known about that. Only Nuna and the ghosts of his past. The threat was not just about land anymore. This was something else entirely. Something deeply, terrifyingly personal. As Kane turned and stormed away, the wind began to pick up whipping dust from the street in sudden, violent gusts. The sky to the west was turning a bruised, sickly yellow. A sandstorm was coming. The storm hit with the force of a physical blow. The sky vanished, replaced by a churning, suffocating wall of sand and grit. Visibility dropped to mere feet. The world became a maelstrom of howling wind and stinging dust. Nuna, grabbing Abigail's hand, knew they couldn't make it back to the cabin. The only refuge was the largest, sturdiest building in town, the saloon. They burst through the swinging doors, followed by Dr. Reed, into a scene of tense, claustrophobic chaos. Half the town had sought shelter there. The air was thick with the smell of whiskey, sweat, and fear. Lamps cast a flickering, hellish glow through the swirling dust that seeped through every crack in the walls. And then they saw him. In the center of the room near the bar stood Jedediah Kane, Sheriff Thorne beside him, their faces grim. With them were 4 hard-faced men, hired guns by the look of them. Kane's posse. He had been waiting. The hearing was just a prelude. This was the true trial. Nowhere left to run, Apache Kane's voice cut through the howl of the wind. The townsfolk scrambled back, creating a wide, deadly circle in the middle of the room. "Kane, for God's sake, there are women and children here," Dr. Reed pleaded, pushing Abigail behind him. Kane laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "This has nothing to do with them. This is between me and him." He pulled the worn leather wallet from his breast pocket. This time he opened it. He threw a faded photograph onto a nearby table. It showed a smiling woman and a small boy. 5 years ago. Willow Creek. A band of Apache raiders swept through my ranch, murdered them both. My wife, my son. His voice cracked thick with a grief that had curdled into pure hatred. The leader of that band was a warrior known for his cunning. They called him the Ghost Hawk, and his wife wore a silver locket engraved with that very bird. He pointed a trembling finger at Nuna. You are the Ghost Hawk. You took everything from me. Your raid on the bank was just an excuse to get to you. The children, the land, all of it was a trap. To draw you out, to make you face me. The saloon was dead silent, save for the screaming wind outside. Nuna stared at Cain, the pieces of a terrible puzzle falling into place. The personal vendetta, the insane obsession. But Cain was wrong. I was not at Willow Creek. Nuna said, his voice flat and cold. The day your family was taken, my own camp was attacked. My wife, my son, they were killed. Liar Cain roared his hand, dropping to his pistol. The raiders' Nuna continued, his voice rising with an intensity that commanded the room. They were not Apache. They were white men, outlaws dressed to look like us, to stoke the fires between our people and yours. I know this, because I saw the face of their leader. He locked eyes with Cain, the shared pain, a terrible bridge between them. He was a man with a serpent tattooed on his wrist, the same man who took the hawk locket from my wife's neck as she lay dying. Cain froze, his face a mask of disbelief. The world seemed to stop. In that instant of shared shocking revelation, they were no longer enemies, but two men standing on opposite sides of the same grave victims of the same faceless evil. The moment was shattered by Sheriff Thorne. Enough of this nonsense, he yelled, drawing his own gun. He's trying to trick you, Cain. Kill him. But Cain was paralyzed, his entire world, his entire 5-year quest for revenge, crumbling around him. The hesitation cost Thorne everything. From the back of the saloon, one of Cain's hired guns, a man with a sly, cruel face, raised his pistol. But he didn't aim at Nuna. He aimed at Jedediah Cain. "Sorry, boss," the man sneered, and a serpent tattoo coiled visibly on his wrist as he pulled back the hammer. "Mr. Blackwood sends his regards. Said to clean up any loose ends." The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. Cain staggered back, clutching his chest, a look of pure, agonizing comprehension on his face. He had been a pawn all along. His grief had been used and manipulated by the very man who had caused it. Chaos erupted. Gunfire exploded from all sides. Nuna reacted with the instinct of a warrior. He shoved Abigail and Dr. Reed behind the thick oak bar, overturned a heavy table for cover, and returned fire. The saloon became a whirlwind of splintering wood, shattering glass, and acrid gun smoke. The hired guns were professionals, moving with deadly efficiency, trying to eliminate all witnesses. Nuna fought with a cold, desperate fury. This was not just a battle for his life, but for the lives of his new family. He saw the serpent-tattooed man reloading near the door, preparing to finish the job. A primal rage, the ghost of the warrior he once was, surged through him. Revenge was a heartbeat away. But then he heard a cry. Abigail. A stray bullet had grazed her arm. She was bleeding, her face pale with shock and pain. He saw the two paths before him in a flash of violent light, and the path of vengeance that led to the man with the serpent tattoo, and the path of protection that led to the crying child behind the bar. The warrior died, and the father was reborn. He ignored his sworn enemy. He scrambled to Abigail's side, tearing a strip from his shirt to create a makeshift bandage. "It is a shallow wound," he said, his voice calm and steady, amidst the cacophony shielding her body with his own. "You are brave?" You are strong." The serpent-tattooed man saw his chance. He raised his pistol, aiming for Nuna's exposed back. A shot rang out, but it wasn't from the outlaw's gun. Jedediah Kane, bleeding out on the floor, had used his last ounce of strength to raise his own pistol and fire. The serpent-tattooed man crumpled a look of surprise on his face. Kane's eyes found Nuna's across the smoky room. In them was not hatred, but a silent, agonizing plea for forgiveness. Then, as the saloon roof groaned under the immense pressure of the storm, his eyes went vacant. Justice, twisted and bloody, had been served. The remaining outlaws, their leader gone, fled into the raging storm, swallowed by the fury of the elements. Silence fell, broken only by the howling wind and Abigail's quiet sobs. The sandstorm, having borne witness to the bloody climax, began to recede, its rage finally spent. As the wind died and the dust settled, the survivors emerged from the wreckage of the saloon into a world scoured clean. The truth, ugly and violent, lay exposed for all of Silver Creek to see. Judge Pike, taking charge, listened to the testimony of Dr. Reed and the other witnesses. The story of Jedediah Kane's manipulated grief and the outlaws masquerading as Apaches spread through the town not as a whisper, but as a chilling testament to their own blind prejudice. Sheriff Thorne, his authority and reputation shattered, was stripped of his badge. He became a ghost in his own town, a walking reminder of how easily righteousness can curdle into tyranny. In the days that followed, the town reckoned with its shame. There was no grand apology, but something more meaningful began to happen. A sack of flour left on the cabin porch. A bolt of warm wool from the mercantile. Deputy Miller, now Sheriff Miller, would ride out, not on official business, but with a piece of hard candy for Abigail, and a quiet, respectful nod for Nuna. They were small axe seeds of acceptance, planted in the hard soil of regret. 1 year later, the cabin was no longer just a shelter, but a home. A new room had been added, built with timber Nuna had felled and shaped himself. A garden tended by Abigail bloomed with corn and squash. The twins Jonah and Levi were sturdy toddlers, their laughter the new constant music of the homestead. One evening, as the sun set, painting the hills in hues of rust and gold, Nuna took Abigail to the quiet, rocky outcrop that overlooked their land. The world below was peaceful, bathed in a soft, forgiving light. He took the small wooden hawk, the one he had carved for his lost son, and pressed it into her hand. "The hawk is a guardian," he said, his voice soft. "It watches from above. It keeps its family safe. This was for him. Now it is for you." Abigail's fingers closed around the carving. She looked at it for a long moment, then reached into the pocket of her dress. She pulled out the silver locket, the last remnant of her past life, the symbol of the mother she had lost. She walked to a flat stone at the edge of the outcrop and gently placed the locket upon it, the engraved hawk facing the sky. She did not bury it or hide it away. She left it as a marker, a testament to the love that had brought her here, but no longer a chain that bound her to her grief. She turned back to Nuna, her eyes clear and bright. She took his hand, her small fingers intertwining with his. Together, they stood and watched the last rays of sunlight fade, a new family forged in tragedy, bound by choice, and finally at peace in their sanctuary. They looked not to the past, but to the endless horizon of their future, a future they would face together.